So we're now on to medieval theater. Um, we have to actually go from the end of Rome, the fall of Rome. Around the 4th century, looking at your board notes here, around the 4th century, you start to see drama emerging in the various states in Europe. And that came from the emergence of a dead hero, this worship of a dead hero. Kind of like in the Greeks, the funeral rites, funeral dances of Adrastus. This is now a new dead hero whose name is Jesus Christ. So it started out as antiphonal song, wherein a chorus member would be answered by other choruses. And so it sort of started out like the Greek dithyrambics, and then slowly later dialogue is added. So the way that they sort of did it was that a cantor or half choir would be answered by another choir. And so it really was song, just song and song, until later on they started to add some dialogue. These dialogues were then known as tropes, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So we go back to Rome and the fall of Rome. Now everybody knows that the fall of Rome is 476 AD, and the thing is that Rome was sacked several times before that. By the way, I use AD and BC instead of this sort of BCE, CE crap, just to let you know. Rome was sacked by the Visigoths in like 410 BC, then by the Vandals, which are a Germanic tribe, in 455, not BC, AD, excuse me, in 455 AD, and then finally the Huns came in and sacked it, and Rome fell in 476 AD. But now that was the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire was still standing. Its capital was Constantinople, and it was run by Justinian. And Justinian didn't dislike theater. His wife was a very well-known mime actress, so he didn't have a problem with theater. It's just a simple fact that he spent so much time beating away all of these invading tribes and trying to keep the Eastern Roman Empire surviving that he didn't have time to be focusing on theater. So that's why theater sort of phases out in the Eastern Roman Empire as well. Now, because of all of this sacking and then Rome finally falling in 476 AD, all of your artists, especially your actors and whatnot, would go ahead and take off. They started running north into Europe. You know, they sort of said, "Holy shit, we got to go," and off they went. Actually, it would have been Latin, so it would have been Sanctum Sanctorum Carcas. But anyway, off they went into northern Europe. So now they're traveling bands, which is how theater sort of begins in the medieval era, traveling groups of actors. But what survived through all of this was the Roman Catholic Church. And we do see the Catholicism spreading into various areas in medieval Europe. So along around 6th century AD, Pope Gregory, he was a pope between 1590 and 1604. 590, not 1604, 590 and 604. So he started creating a sort of a process or a school to train young boys. All kidding aside, he was training young boys to sing. And it is from that training that we get what is known as Gregorian chant. If you've ever heard that phrase before, it's sort of a low, sort of a baseline chant that goes underneath the lyrics, or then later became adorned by other singing. If you're familiar with the Australian didgeridoo, it's sort of like that sort of underlying tone. And so that is where the Gregorian chant comes from. It's a plain song approach to music, and the reason he did that is because people tend to remember things put to song. Now, you've got to understand that the population this time in church were predominantly illiterate, and they couldn't read their Bible, even if they could have one, because printing wasn't really invented yet as a math. The printing press doesn't come around until the 1400s. So printing was not available to them, so books were very scarce and very expensive, so they wouldn't have had a Bible. And all of the sermons at that time were given in Latin, because that's what the Roman Catholic Church dictated. So they didn't speak Latin, they couldn't read, So there was really no way for them to understand what was being told to them in these sermons. And so Pope Gregory came up with this way to sort of get these people to sing-song this a lot of the liturgy, and that helped them to remember it. Again, not that they knew what it meant. That's where theater started coming back in, where they started doing dramatic reenactments. So around 8 to 900s AD, you start seeing dramatic reenactments appear, usually held in cemeteries or catacombs or other people's houses, because the worship of Christ in many areas was still punishable by death. So they had to sort of do this underground, as it were. By the way, again, I'm back at Kelly's, and I have German beer with me this time. At least it's German, to deal with medieval era. So, we have usually actual reenactments at that time were various things, like either the Last Supper or Christmas, Easter festivals about Christ's birth, death, so on and so forth. So it became, as time goes on, by the 1400s, it becomes a huge source of entertainment for the masses, and we'll get there once we start moving it on out of the church. Around the 9th century, so late 1800 or late 800s AD. Sorry, I'm still kind of like lagging from getting back from Australia, where I was actually predominantly drunk on the flight back. So, somewhere around the 9th century, we have an actual text of a reenactment from France, and this is known as the Quem Quiritus trope. You should see it on your board notes there under 9th century Quem Quiritus trope. And that actually, the interesting thing with that one was that since we have the text of it, it really is them just going to Christ's tomb to see him there, and then they're told that he's not there, he's risen. It's a couple of people going, hey, we came to see the body of Christ, and they went, oh, he's not here, he rose, and they went, oh, hallelujah. I'm paraphrasing, but it's predominantly what it's about. And this was sort of sung or chanted. It comes from Winchester Cathedral, and the earliest English one, the earliest English one comes from Winchester Cathedral, and I don't have a name for that one. The Bishop of Winchester, somewhere in the 10th century, described exactly in that text how it's to be performed. So we have essentially stage directions from the 10th century, so 900s, we have actual stage directions. We don't have them from the Quem Quiritus, we just have the text itself. Also in the 10th century, so the 900s, we have the Adoration of the Shepherds, which is, again, one of the first early dramas that doesn't necessarily deal with actual birth or death of Christ. So now we're starting to see other stories in the Bible being performed as part of the Easter service, right? So we move on now to entertainers on your list there, okay? There were entertainers that they were very specific in what they did. These people, again, most of them early on, very early medieval era, were trained in Rome as entertainers. So you know, as we talked about in Rome, that they were highly trained. They were trained in song, dance, mime, acrobats, and contortionists, fire eaters, and all sorts of various skills that they had that they brought into the medieval era. These would not have been the people that were performing in the church. These would be the people going from town to town, who were, by the way, still excommunicated from the church and would have been arrested had they been caught. So these people were nomadic and they moved a lot. They were always in trouble with the Catholic Church, and one of the interesting things that I have in there is during the 2nd century, one church elder asked whether the God of truth, who abhors falsehood, can receive into his kingdom those whose features and hair and age and sex are all pretense. So he's basically saying that because actors lie for a living, they cannot possibly enter the kingdom of heaven. So it's kind of an interesting way that these people looked at actors at this point in time. I think I'm kind of going off on a bit of a tangent here with that, but I'm looking at your so training zone is right. Travel in groups, typically families, because it was cheaper that way. You didn't have to pay every actor. You just the money that came in, that was the family money. And they were always in trouble with the church, and they were excommunicated and would be arrested. And there's a definition, I've got to actually read it because I don't have this one memorized, but there's a definition of performers. And this is from Thomas de Chaume of Salisbury, who wrote at the end of the 13th century. All right, so late 1200s. All right, there are three kinds of histriones. He's still using the Roman name of actors. Some transform and transfigure their bodies in indecent dance and gesture, and without any decency unclothe themselves and wear grotesque masks. There are others who have no definite profession, but act as vagabonds, not having any permanent home. They frequent the courts of the great and say scandalous and shameful things concerning those who are not present, so as to delight the rest. There's also a third class of histriones, who play musical instruments for the delight of men, and of these there are two types. Some frequent drinking places and lewd gatherings, and sing their stanzas to movement and lasciviousness. There are others who are called jongleurs, who sing of the gestes or actions of princes and the lives of saints. So I'm rather offended at that concept of frequenting drinking establishments, but nonetheless, that's their definition of the types of actors there are. So let's look at that as we move down into entertainers. The scop is kind of the one that he's talking about, move from place to place. That was an actor, northern to eastern Europe, from the 5th to 7th, or possibly even up into the 8th century AD. Minstrels, the jongleurs he's calling about these, play an instrument. Okay, a jongleur was a minstrel, a professional minister of entertainment who recited verse with appropriate gestures and could play a musical instrument. Jongleur was the only one that could play a musical instrument. All right. Court jesters were commonly minstrels because they could play a musical instrument. They would recite bawdy songs and so on and so forth to the delight of court. So, if you're familiar with court jesters, that would have been a jongleur of the time. Okay. And some of them were really rich. Many of them lived very poor lives, but a lot of the court jesters became rather rich. Galliards were a traveling entertainer. They were scholars, actually, usually instructors or professors of some sort. They became traveling entertainers. They would tell tales, legend, lore, and all that kind of stuff like that. And when you connect them up to the court jester, someone who could play a musical instrument and tell a folklore or tales of history or things like that, that becomes what is known as the troubadour, if you're familiar with that term, if you've ever seen that. Those of you who saw the Disney Robin Hood, the Alan Adale Rooster character, he's a troubadour. He's telling tales and he plays an instrument. All right, so that's what that is. And those are the basic ones that we want to be looking at, is the minstrels, the galliards, the jongleurs, and that will pretty much round out what you need to know about the entertainers themselves. Looking down at the on your medieval board notes, the next thing you see on there is the Church Edict of 1281. Okay, so the first thing we need to look at here is that the church is where actual theater as we know it sort of began to reemerge. I know it sounds odd, but they had to teach the people in the church about the stories of the Bible, and the only way to do that would be to perform it. Again, because they couldn't understand the Latin, they couldn't read anything, so they had to have these stories performed for them, and that's why it began in the church. But the edicts say that all of the performers are outlaws, so they didn't really have an opportunity to perform in church. It was performed by the priests and the nuns and so on and so forth. This becomes a problem a little bit later. All right. Everything in the church, the Catholic Church, has to follow a specific order, and it was very symbolic. There's patterns, symbols, they all mean something, and they were used in these church sort of productions, as it were, these tropes. These symbols and stuff were used because the medieval mind could connect those to something that it means. The cross with the fire on it means something to the medieval mind as they're being taught there. And so these were all a part of teaching all of the scriptures. So in 1210, Pope Innocent III ordered that plays should be presented outside the church. We're jumping down a bit here. Actually, I skipped your section there on guilds. So let me run back to that for a second here and look at the guilds. There were a couple of guilds for the actors. The church edict of 1281 said that no clerk shall be jongleurs, gauliards, or buffoons. Clerks meaning any type of merchant, candlestick maker, haberdasher, glover, anything along that line. Though they were not allowed to be actors. That was not a profession. Okay. By the by, that would also mean theoretically that no one in the church is allowed to be an actor either. But they sort of look past that because they're not really actors. They're just reenacting stories of the Bible. That's how they get away with it. Okay? But regardless, there were still guilds that were set up for minstrels. And Guild for Minstrels was formed in 1321 in France, and there was one in England in 1469. All right? And they graded these people into 3 groups. Let me get over to your board notes here and scroll down a bit. Okay. They classified their entertainers into 3 groups. Minstrels, again, the ones that could play an instrument. They were highly skilled, so they were at the top of the list. Okay? Traveling actors, the gauliards, were sort of the second of the list. And then fire eaters, animal trainers, and acrobats are the bottom of the barrel. They're the circus performers, and you know, let's be honest, they still are really considered the bottom of the barrel. All right? So down on your list here, we have then a theater reemerging the church. We talked about that already. The illiteracy of the population, the Latin sermons, and the graphic depiction that they had that all shows these people how they are supposed to act in life and gives them the stories of the Bible. If you ever looked at medieval architecture, you should take a look at it sometime. Find some online. Look at the doorways. A lot of the doorways have demons and devils around them, and I've even seen some doorways that have like women with their legs spread open and demons all around them, saying like, you know, this is the doorway to hell, which I don't necessarily disagree with, to be honest. But at any rate, the concept of it is that they show you what's evil, and they show you what's purity, right, through statuary or reliefs in their architecture. So they're already used to pictorial manners of learning what's good and bad. Movement to actual plays or performances of stories of the Bible was simply a natural next step. Okay? Oh, I did something wrong there. Now I can't find it. Okay, here we go. So, as we said there, the performers are the priests and the nuns. And Pope Innocent, around 1210, we're going back to there again now, I said, ordered that the plays should be taken outside the church. He did that because he kind of went, you know what? We're excommunicating actors, and y'all are acting. I mean, I know we keep saying, we're not acting, we're just physically doing stories of the Bible. And he's like, well, it's a bit dodgy. It's still kind of the same thing. So they moved it outside the church. Now, there's 2 reasons for that. Number 1 being that it still wasn't too good to be acting in a house of God, and the population had begun to grow to this point where it's very difficult to get everybody inside the church. So they moved it out to the steps out in front of the church initially. Somewhere between 1200 and 1300 AD, those plays, the church decided they shouldn't even be connected to the church, so let's move them down into town. And so they moved down to the town square. This is kind of an important step. So, when they moved to the town square, these had to be taken over by someone else. Granted, the stories themselves were still all okayed or overseen by the church, so that the people in the town weren't coming up with these cracky stories that made no sense and had no connection to the Bible. You know, like, well, Jesus rode a whale into the mouth of the... You know, it could have gone awry. And so they still kept a handle on the scripts themselves. But overall, they didn't act in them, and they didn't sanction actors for them. But obviously that had to come, and we'll talk about that in just a second. In 1264, Pope Urban he determines certain days that these plays will be performed. And this was the Thursday after Trinity Sunday. I don't know what day that is, because I don't know Trinity Sunday, because I'm not Catholic, and nor am I kind of even remotely religious. So you can look up what Trinity Sunday is, and that'll tell you when those were supposed to be performed. All right? But there were also a series of festivals around this time that were being done fairly regularly and supported by the church. The first one of note is the Feast of the Boy Bishop. And the Feast of the Boy Bishop is kind of an interesting one. This is when lower clergy were allowed to take over the role of their superiors. So kind of like, if you work at a McDonald's, there's one day when all of the cashiers get to be manager, right? That's kind of basically what they did. That was abolished in 1541 because I think probably they had some problems with the lower clergy going, well, now that we're manager for a day, let's shake shit up. And that got to be dodgy. So they dumped that after a few hundred years. Now, the Feast of Fools and Asses is the second one, and that is basically sort of a parody based on Jesus' arrival to Jerusalem. Because if you know your Bible, Jesus arrived in Jerusalem on an ass. I don't really know my Bible, but I happen to know that. So, at any rate, that continued well into like the 17th century, so into the 1600s. The Dance of Death was an interesting one. And that was sort of a pantomime of music, dance, and singing that was sort of an allegorical representation of taking an entire cross-section of the population to the grave. Pretty much showing the sort of like, you know what, everybody ends here. No matter what you do in your life, it's going to end here. And then, of course, that puts back into Judgment Day and all that kind of thing. So the Dance of Death is really kind of almost akin to the Day of the Dead with the sort of Hispanic religion. If you're familiar with the Day of the Dead at all, I don't know if you are. But, so that's pretty much what that ends up being. And kind of similar to the one we have in Greek theater as well. But there's not, the difference between the two is they're not necessarily paying homage to their ancestors in the Dance of Death. They're literally simply showing everyone in the world will, at some point in time, die, and this is why you have to go to church and lead a good life. All right? So that's, that's a real interesting, and I'm sure that was a fun festival. Moving on to architecture is our next section here. Now, they didn't build theaters in medieval theater. They originally started doing these inside the church. So if you've ever been in a Catholic church, I've been in a few, most Catholic churches, especially the older ones, definitely medieval ones, were based off of Roman Senate building structure. So you had sort of a circle at the top, right, at the very front of the building, and then a long hallway. So I mean, you can go to any major Catholic cathedral type church and look, and it'll be a long hallway to a big, huge open area, which is where the altar is. So along that long hallway, you typically find some niches that are currently, you have places, a statue in them, and places to sit incense or pray or whatever, so on and so forth. Those were called mansions or houses. And inside those niches, they would put each scene. So basically what would happen is you would come in, if they're going to do a presentation that day, you would walk around from niche to niche and watch each scene in progression. The cool thing is right up by the altar was the sort of the culmination of it, and it was a hell mouth. It was a big, huge, scary-looking demon mouth that quite often had smoke coming out of it, possibly even fire, and it basically showed you this is where you go when you go to hell, through this big, gaping, sharp-toothed, smoke-breathing mouth. It's kind of awesome. I've seen some pictures of some that are, and it's pretty incredible. So that's an interesting little set piece. But that's what the architecture was initially. And mansions and houses, two different words for the same exact thing. But when it moved down into the town square, they had to build something to put these scenes in. So they built wagons. So now what happens in the town square, instead of you walking from scene to scene, the scenes now travel past you on wagons. So you stand there and the entire show will go past you in a circle. And that's how they ended up taking care of that sort of problem with moving it into the town square. Now, these wagons were built by trade guilds, kind of like the people in the Greeks, the rich folk who were paying for the plays. Trade guilds would compete to see whose scene could be better. So you've got the Butchers Guild, you've got the Glovers Guild, the Coopers Guild. Coopers are people who make barrels. By the way, that's where most of our last names come from. People named Cooper or Glover or Fletcher or things like that. These are actually all from medieval era, where my name would be perhaps John the Cooper, so John Cooper, because I made barrels for a living. So that's kind of where our names come from. So these trade guilds would put on these scenes. Again, the scenes themselves written or at least approved by the church, and they were then produced by these trade guilds. Now, the important thing about the trade guilds is the fact that without them, we would not have the reemergence of the professional actor, because they certainly didn't act it out. They had to get professional actors to come in and play in the scenes. This is the reemergence of the professional actor, and the interesting thing about it is, quite often, the contract for the actor would be such that I will come in, I will play for this amount of money, this role for this amount of money, and then you will provide me with a safe house so I don't get arrested during the process, and then you will get my ass out of town as soon as possible, right afterwards, so that I don't get arrested. And we've seen, actually, I've come across some contracts from that time frame, and in the contracts are fines for the actors. Okay, if you show up drunk, you're fined X amount of money. So clearly not much has changed in the hundreds of years since then. So that's the importance of the trade guilds and the pageant wagons. All right. So we move on to plays on your board notes, and there are 5 types of plays. 4 really important. The 5th one, kind of cool, but not necessarily terribly important. And that is, the first one is the Passion Play. Now, the Passion Play is stories of the life of Christ, okay? And the Passion Plays could be any type of, any area in the life of Christ. Sometimes it would be the beginning of it, sometimes it would be the end of his life. Some of them went all the way through his life. There's one play called the Maastricht Passion Play, written in Maastricht, Germany, Netherlands, actually. I've been there. It's kind of a really cool place. But that was published somewhere before 1350. And it consisted of, and I don't have these memorized, so I have to look at this over here, where I've got it down here. That consisted of these: creation and fall of the angels, creation and fall of man, debate of justice and pity, prophecies of the birth of Christ, annunciation, nativity, 3 kings and Herod, massacre of the innocents, flight into Egypt, Jesus in the temple, baptism, temptation, calling of Peter and Andrew, wedding at Cana, Jesus at the house of Simon, resurrection of Lazarus, entrance in Jerusalem, expulsion of the moneylenders, Jesus at the house of Martha, council of the synagogue, garden of olives, arrival of Judas and the soldiers. That's from creation to just before Jesus is crucified. That's a lot more than is in a normal Passion Play, but that's what it is in this one. So you get an idea that it's a series of plays, okay? The morality plays, of which Every Man, which you have to read for this class, is a perfect example of, and one of the best examples we have. The morality plays are just simply plays that are intended to teach the audience a specific moral, okay? And they use allegorical characters. Like you'll find in Every Man, there are characters like strength and good deeds and kindred and knowledge, right? Allegorical means the fact that those are concepts. Strength is a concept, right? But the medieval mind can't really handle that concept. So what they're going to do is they're going to actually make it a personification. This man personifies our strength, our inner strength, or whatever. This man personifies our knowledge. This character does, right? This character personifies death. So that's an allegorical character. Morality plays have allegorical characters in them, and they have some sort of a moral. You will hopefully get the moral out of Every Man. It's a bit cocky, but then again, it's Catholic Church. So, Miracle plays are plays that dramatize incidents from the lives of saints or martyrs. Many of them are based on biblical stories. Some are fictional, but they all revolve around miraculous powers or divine intervention. Then you've got the mystery or cycle plays. Okay, these are plays of stories from the Bible, and they're sort of interknit into some sort of a, I want to say, chronological whole, but not necessarily. All right, and there are most of the cycle plays are all gone. There's only 4 that are extant, and that's the York, the Chester, the Wakefield, and the N Town. They call it N Town because it's on the manuscript itself. There's an N, and then we can't read the rest of it. So it's the N Town is the only thing that we know of it. So that's what a cycle plays is. And cycle plays were the ones that were put on the pageant wagons, scene by scene, and taken around town. Okay. Let's see here. And then we have mummers. Now, mummers are basically sort of folk drama. Robin Hood was a mummer. The original Robin Hood play was a mummer. It was talked about a folklore, stories of various, like King Arthur would be a mummer play. So that's what it would be all folklore stories, and usually done sort of in the small towns and stuff. Not church sanctioned, not church written, stories about folklore. There was one mummer play I recall that was something to the effect of a man that or villagers that would masquerade and go town to town and giving gifts to the poor. So kind of like early Santa Claus type thing. So that was an old mummer of that. So it was very cool. They also would occasionally reenact various battles, various important battles. So anything along that line could be considered a mummer. Now, one of the things, it doesn't say this on your board notes, but I just thought I'd bring it up because it's kind of interesting, and that is the costuming that was done with a lot of these things was predominantly sort of contemporary clothing. But they would do things like wings for angels and so on and so forth, hoofs for devil characters. So they got kind of interesting with their costuming in that regard. They would use masks, much like the Greeks did. Usually masks were for the demons and devils, and they would be horned, and they would be animal masks. Sometimes they'd have huge butts, and their genitals would be hanging out. And so we haven't gotten too far away from the Romans, to be honest. But that was okay because it made them grotesque, which therefore was okay by the church, because you want that concept of demons and devils being grotesque and the angels being very pretty and angelic. You see, under playwrights, we have one. Well, not a whole lot. Most of the playwrights signed their works anonymous. Now, a couple reasons for it. As a possibility. One theory being that if you wrote plays, you didn't want the church to know you're writing plays because it might get you into trouble. The other theory behind it is that the concept of what we do, as we're talking about we as in priests or the clergy, what we do in the name of God, and to put my own name on it thereby is somewhat hubris. So I put anonymous because it's actually God's work. So for whatever reason, most of them are listed as anonymous. One playwright that we know of is a woman, a nun from Gandersheim. Northern Germany is where that is, actually. Roughly middle of the 10th century. And her name was Roswitha. And it's an awesome name, I think, too. It just makes you think of a big, huge East German nun who can carry 6 steins in each hand. But anyway, she wrote a play. She actually wrote her plays really similarly to Terence's comedies, and used that as the basis for her, but used religious subjects instead of bawdy comedies. All right, so these plays were a lot of the forerunners to the later on the mystery and morality plays. So that's our playwright. All right, so we get to the decline of medieval theater, and okay, what really happened as far as the decline is this. Okay, the church began to lose a lot of its power, and it especially began to lose a lot of its power around 1536 with the creation of the Church of England. If you're not familiar with the creation of the Church of England, what happened was Henry VIII wanted to get rid of yet another wife. The Catholic Church said, no, we're not tolerating this crap anymore. He said, oh, I can't divorce her. Okay, fine, I'm going to create my own church because I'm king. And so he created the Church of England, Protestantism. That's where it starts. And that break started to make a sort of a shattering in the use of Catholic drama in England. Now, a little later down the line, Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558. She started to suppress and then later outlawed all religious drama in England. So England is sort of the start of the end of medieval drama, even though the Renaissance drama actually begins in Italy. Regardless, this is the sort of the downfall of medieval drama. Then we start getting schools and universities, and the schools and universities, why they're important is because you start getting people who are learning not in monasteries anymore, because that used to be the only place you could ever get education in medieval Europe, was in monasteries. Now we have schools. Now they can learn more than simply biblical knowledge and Latin. Now they're learning other languages, now they're learning theory, philosophy, and now you're beginning to see writers appear. And we'll talk about that when we get into Renaissance theater. So after that, we have the discovery of Greece and Rome, okay? And the discovery of Greece and Rome started to make people thinking and looking back toward the classics. And it's around this time early in the Renaissance that you start seeing, they discover a lot of the lost Greek and Roman plays. So putting all these together, the Catholic Church is losing a lot of power, and schools and universities popping up to where people are becoming men of letters and can write and can come up with different stories. That's when we start to see the end of this medieval drama and the beginning of the Renaissance, which is, the Renaissance actually means a rebirth. And we'll talk about that when we get into Renaissance theater.